So it's a great time of the year again. Professional basketball finals, and if you get bored with that, there's always professional hockey finals to fall back on. I know I said it last year, but it's true. Great time of the year. There's a scene this week after Game 6 between the Boston Celtics and the Philadelphia 76ers. Boston, who had the best record during the regular season, ranked number 1 for the playoffs, down 3-2 in a 7-game series against Philadelphia. Their backs against the proverbial wall. They were behind most of the first 3 quarters. If they lost the game, they're out. Their top scorer, best player, had all but been shut out in the first 3 quarters. In the final quarter, he just lit it up and led them to a come-from-behind victory. So, in a post-game interview, the reporter said to him, "You struggled through the first 3 quarters and then 16 points in the fourth quarter. How do you describe the confidence you had to trust yourself down the stretch?" He didn't even stop and think through a response. Immediately, he said, I'm one of the best basketball players in the world. Then he went on with some predictable sports interview drivel. I'm humbly one of the best basketball players in the world. Okay. Can't get much more humble brag than that, right? We're working our way through the life of the great King David, who, although he never said it, never counted on it, was one of arguably the greatest of God's leaders in our story, the story that God is pulling off in history and still is, through us, for us, and in us if we let him. Regardless of how it looks at any moment, it's happening. David, who sought to live life with one overall motto, I have set the Lord always before me because he is at my right hand. I will never be shaken. No matter how far behind whatever the current scoreboard says, I will not be shaken. And one reason David was chosen by God to be his king was that God saw him as a man after his own heart. Not a perfect heart, and he knew it, but a man who, he's willing to have his heart tested. Later in life than where we are at this point in his story, when he's finally through the journey of being a fugitive from maniac, out of control, narcissistic King Saul, knowing the tendencies of his own heart, David says this to God, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me. Know my anxious thoughts, my disquieting thoughts, the thinking patterns underneath my thoughts that lead to my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting." Now that's humble. That's the prayer of someone who's not letting himself believe he can pull it off, can come back simply because he's the GOAT. So, today's episode, chapter 24 of 1 Samuel. Turn there. David encounters a huge heart test experience, a crucial heart test for living a not be shaken life. He faces it and he aces it. Now, he doesn't always pass this test, by the way. He did not pass it when he started running from Saul in chapter 21, and it led to many innocent people being killed, and he will not pass it when he gets more mature, when things are going well at certain times. And will have a huge impact on others. But in the experience we look at today, he aces it. What is the core test? Well, we could look at chapter 24 from a number of angles, but it seems to me, and I'll show you why, it seems to me at the heart of it all, in David's heart, it's a control thing. David passes the control test. I think a case can be made, and I'll do that the encounter we'll look at today is David at his absolute best. He comes face to face with the control freak in here, and he wins. Know any control freaks? See if you can identify with any of these lines. Control, you're saying like it's a bad thing. I'm not a control freak, but can I show you the right way to do it? Just because I'm a highly driven, focused, motivated leader with high expectations does not mean I'm a control freak. And yes, you may take time out to listen to my advice, and no, you may not do things your way. As someone put it, funny how you never realize you're a control freak until things are out of control and you freak. Here's the view from the other side. If I was meant to be controlled, I would come with a remote. I shared that line with LaDonna once, and she laughed and said, "Do you know how many times I wished I had a remote control for you?" I said, is that a statement about me or about you? Right? I was sitting one day, many years ago, in the dentist chair, trying to do the mind over matter thing about this procedure I was about to endure that I was not looking forward to. And the very wise and experienced dental assistant handed me the suction tube and said, "Here, how about you manage this?" She showed me how to flip the lever to turn the suction on and off, and then she said, "Anytime you feel you need to, just raise it up. We'll be ready." I thought, cool, I feel better already. And then she said it. "It may help you feel a little more in control." I had a lot of time that day to think about that comment. I thought about how much of the trauma of sitting in a dentist chair was about control, feeling no control over what is happening to me in a very vulnerable situation, right? And then it hit me. Did she do that just for me, or did she do that for everybody? I asked my wife later if she did it for her. I won't tell you the answer. And I recognize that in every experience in life, control issues are probably more of a factor than we recognize. The control thing is way bigger than we realize. Why? Because it's actually central to who I am as a human being. An essential aspect of who we were created by God as humans to be was to rule under God all of creation. And rule is all about control. But when that all went south, because we did not want to rule under God, we wanted to be God over ourselves, every single human struggles with control issues in some way. It's just us. So, let's get back to David. In terms of his life circumstances, David has not been in control of his own life and destiny for some time now. For several years, some say about 4 years, he's been on the run, hiding and fleeing from a very much go for control, out of control King Saul, who was very much in control of David's circumstances, doing everything he can to find David and eliminate him. In spite of that, David's entourage is growing. He's responsible for more and more family who come to him, afraid of what Saul might do to them. And he has a growing team that's either alienated from Saul themselves or are tired of Saul's dysfunctional leadership. But they're also getting tired of running, tired of being homeless, of having to scrounge for food. And David knows that if something doesn't happen soon, for some of them, it will be like, "Sorry, bro, we love you, but we can't take it any longer." There's a lot of pressure on David. And then one day, David gets the opportunity to take control. To take things into his own hands. Remember chapter 23? That phrase continues to be a central theme in this chapter. We saw it 9 times, but in your hands in chapter 23. It's going to be 11 times in this chapter. It starts with Saul in chapter 23, who can't find David in the open wilderness, and discovering that David is helping people in this walled city, and he says, "Got him! God has delivered him into my hands." What is into my hands all about? It's about control. He's mine. I own him. Can you think of a better way to describe what control is? In my hands. This chapter is all about the control thing. David is on high alert. He's warned by God to get out of the cave. And chapter 23, verse 14, David, or day after day, Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. It ticks Saul off, and his pursuit of David just gets more intense. All of Saul's resources are now focused on one thing, getting rid of David. But God has these creative ways of protecting David, the last of which, the end of chapter 23, is that just as David seems to have walked into another trap, and Saul thinks he's got him, someone tells Saul, Saul, you got to go now. The Philistines are attacking your turf. And so David is free again. In chapter 23, verse 29, it says that David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. That's where we are as we enter chapter 24. Why En-Gedi? Well, because En-Gedi offers some very natural protection. It's a little region located on the western shore of the Dead Sea, surrounded by rugged wilderness. It's tough to get into, but when you're in it, you are in control because it's tough for your pursuer to get into. You can't pick them off. You can pick them off as they come down the gorge one by one. So you're relatively safe. Why En-Gedi? Well, just as important, En-Gedi had a well-known oasis. Still today, a perennial spring pours out of the hillside with fresh water. Why En-Gedi? Well, what's David's go-to hiding place? A cave. You want caves? En-Gedi's got caves. The hillsides, cliffs of En-Gedi are dotted with caves. It's like, pick a door, Saul, but be careful, wrong one, you're in trouble, right? So, chapter 23, beginning at verse 29, we're going to read a few verses. Chapter 23, and David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. After Saul, chapter 24, verse 1, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told David is in the desert of En-Gedi. And so Saul took 3,000 able or choice men, young men from all Israel, and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. 3,000 of his best men. How many does David have? 600. Saul's trained army outnumbers David's ragtag group 5-1. He will get him this time. Verse 3, he came to the sheep pens along the way, and a cave was there. And Saul went in to relieve himself. Yep, that means exactly what we think it means. And right now is one of those times my wife wishes she had that remote control for me. She's praying, please God, help him control the urge to paint this picture more vividly. Please don't let him remember any stories. You get the picture, right? But it just so happened that of all of the caves in En-Gedi, David and his men were far back in that very cave. Now, some of those caves are, well, they're about the size of an auditorium that would seat 1,000 people. And as they've seen Saul coming along the hillside, looking for them in the caves, they've all squeezed in along the wall at the very back of the cave in the darkest place possible. Saul comes in, and he's just enough in the cave so that his men out in the daylight can't see him. David's men are in the dark, and their eyes have adjusted to the dark, and they can see it all, as if a spotlight is shining on Saul. Can you see the irony here? The one who thinks he has control is put into the most vulnerable position imaginable. The one for whom appearance of control is everything, for whom image is so big, is put into the most embarrassing position possible. Saul is, okay, gotta say it, he's on the throne. Can you imagine what's going on inside the heads of David's men? First, they can hardly keep themselves from laughing. But very quickly, they see the opportunity they had been waiting for. Verse 4, the men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of, when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands.'" When did God say that? It's not recorded anywhere that God said exactly that, although they've certainly heard David use that phrase. Most likely they put their own spin on some of the things they've heard, particularly when David talked to Goliath and observed, and they've come to believe some of the things they've observed and come to believe about David and God. They've put together these statements and they've come up with their own interpretation of this situation that suited them, because that's what we do, right? And in one sense, they're right. David now has the opportunity to take control. That's how his men see it, and that is how David sees it. We know that because after this experience is over, down in verse 10, David makes sure that Saul sees it that way. He says to Saul, "Saul, this day you have seen with your own eyes how God delivered you into my hands." So the question is, David has the opportunity to take control. How will David take control? What will David do when control of his own life and destiny is finally in his hands? Now, this chapter is not a chapter that wraps the control thing up in one neat little bow, 3 steps to make a decision. Life just isn't like that. But this chapter surfaces the central control issue and points to some very common test experiences and questions to reflect on as we come to terms with our desire to take things into our own hands. Or maybe, as in David's case, the opportunity to finally take things into my own hands. His friends are saying, "David, it's so obvious. This is your opportunity. Can't you see how God has opened the door for you? David, can't you see the symmetry here? That's what you said to Goliath. Remember, David? God will give all of you into my hands. David, God's done it again, and this is even more obvious and simpler than Goliath. Just one stroke and we'll have world peace." But David, fairly young David, and very tired David, under huge pressure David, and running out of gas David, has the discernment, the insight that even some of his mature advisors do not. Now, I know this is stating the obvious, but we're often so oblivious to the obvious, aren't we? So let's put it out there. David realizes that the biggest control battles are fought when I have a chance to write the story, when I have a chance to finally make it happen. What will David do when things are in his hands to deal with Saul once and for all? I don't think I could put it better than J.S. Park in his book on David, as he talks about David's overall posture and his overall perspective on this opportunity to take control of the story. The choice David makes, the perspective David adopts, the heart posture David takes is, I will trust God for the better story. That's the control issue this experience of David invites us to consider. At the heart of it all, a central issue we need to process always in everything is, how is God inviting me to trust him for a better story? David uses the circumstance that God has put into his own hands, and he does it in light of the deeper question, will I really and totally trust God and trust myself into God's hands? Now, let's be clear. This account is not a template for every situation, okay? It's not what I'm saying. But it does surface a major question that we need to ask. How is God inviting me to trust him for the better story? And with that as a mindset, the grid through which David sees what's happening, let's look at how David processes this experience and see how it points to some questions. for me that reveal whether I'm really trusting God for a better story. The first question David processes when things are in his own hands to take control is this. It's not said in the text, but it's pretty much implied as we go through the story. Here's the first question. Is this opportunity really the plan, or is it a shortcut in God's plan? Yes, it's an opportunity, but an opportunity for what? A number of years ago, when we were still living in BC, we were returning from Alberta from a rather draining event. Well, it was our son's wedding. In the middle of February, knowing ahead of time we would need to decompress after it was over, we had booked 3 days of skiing at Sun Peaks, northeast of Kamloops. Now, this was in the early days of GPS, and as we were driving down the number 1 highway from Salmon Arm west, in the evening, I said to LaDonna, I was looking at the map last night, and it looks to me like there's a shortcut to Sun Peaks from this side of Kamloops. If we don't have to drive all the way into Kamloops and then all the way back, going east, it would cut off an hour. And so she fired up the GPS in her smartphone, and sure enough, there it was, on the map. So we quickly called our friends who were trailing behind us and said, we found a shortcut, just stick to our tail. And we crossed the river, close to Muddy Creek, went up the side of the mountain, and we turned right. Exactly like the map said. And now the road was a little more of a rural road. But we were following the map. We went another several kilometers, and following the map, we turned left. And it was now one lane had been plowed, probably by a pickup with a little plow in the front, it looked like. And LaDonna was getting a little nervous as we were now in total darkness. But I said, you just make sure we're following the map. We'll be okay. Several kilometers later, we could see that the road we were on was ending. But the map told us to turn right again. And, it was now just one set of 2 tracks. Several days old, on an unplowed road. It was a trail. She said, I think we should turn around. I said, but look, this on the map, it's just only a couple kilometers max. And then it looks like a proper road again. And she said, but it's getting really dark, and the higher we climb, the deeper the snow is getting. And I said, yeah, but we have all-wheel drive. And I won't go anywhere I'm not confident about. And then, after another kilometer, we came up to a gate. A closed gate across the road. And yes, I got out to check, and fortunately, it was locked. It was our first lesson that a GPS is only as good as the map on which it is based. And our maps, our mindset are so based on what we perceive are our own needs to be our own rights, our own dreams. And when a quicker way, a shortcut way is available, it is so easy to take, right? It's like I've wasted long enough. I'm getting tired of the long road. But folks, we know it. And some of us know it from some of our life experiences. Shortcuts rarely work. Some of us right now are in danger of taking a shortcut in God's plan. We're getting tired of waiting, tired of seeing other people pass us on the road of life. We are susceptible to taking control of our own life in ways that will short-circuit God's best for us. Is that you? Are you passing the control test? One of the things we need to think through way more than we do, especially in a culture, in a time of history, when we have way more control of our personal destiny than at any other time in history, and when we're taught that taking charge of my own life is the most important thing, we need to recognize that open doors are just as often, and maybe more often, tests and temptations as they are opportunities. Because I can is not good enough. Because the opportunity presented itself is not good enough. Because I deserve it is even more dangerous. See, this is a sign. That is so flimsy. We make a joke about it, but it's a self-conscious joke, isn't it? If you look back, honestly, how much pain for yourself and for others might you have saved if you had more seriously asked yourself, is this an open door, or is this a test to determine whether I'll stay the course and not get distracted by a shortcut? How long David processed this, we don't know. It can't have been too long, because while Saul is still in his vulnerable position, now we have to see this, because some of us might think, how could David get away with what he's doing here? How was he not seen? Well, Saul's men are not standing around in a circle watching him, okay? Doesn't happen. They are between Saul and the entrance to the cave, with their backs to Saul to give him respectful privacy, but also to keep their eyes peeled for anyone who might think Saul is trapped and vulnerable. So it's the perfect opportunity for David. David's on the other side, behind him, and he seizes it. He pulls out his dagger, and he swiftly and silently moves towards Saul. Can't you just see David's men? As David reaches for his dagger and steps forward, they're going, yes, one stroke. And the story changes. But, the end of verse 4, David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And he goes back into the dark. What? Can't you just hear David's men? They can hardly hold themselves until Saul's gone, and then they all burst out at once. David, he was in your hands, and you let him go. David, what are you afraid of? If you've read the Psalms, especially Psalm 34, you know how David would have answered that. It's not about being afraid of Saul. It's all about the fear of God. Come, my children, I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Fear the Lord, and you will be delivered from all your other fears. Sometimes the control test question is, what is the best fear of God decision here? Yeah, but David, where's your faith? Your trust in God? Don't you remember Goliath? Don't you remember what he said? What you said to him then, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. The battle of the Lord's, he will give you, is the Lord's. He will give all of you into our hands. How would David have answered that question? Where's your faith? Where's your trust? Does that question sometimes mess with your head? It does mine. Especially when it comes as a pious accusation from someone who, for their own reasons, needs you to do something. It's even worse when it comes from our own hearts, though, isn't it? If you had more faith, maybe you would, whatever. We don't know, but it seems to me that David might have said something like this. Okay, let's talk faith. It takes greater faith for me to spare Saul's life than it did to take Goliath's life. This is what trusting God for the better story is all about. Leaving things in the hands of God is often a greater act of faith than claiming a miracle from God. Especially when things are right there for me to take into my own hands. So let's take that one step deeper, well, at least more concrete and specific. In order to show that trusting God for a better story is more than a slogan, more than just religious language, God will allow specific situations where I'm required to take a concrete action, show some tangible behavior, make a specific choice about a real-life issue to show that I'm leaving it in his hands rather than taking it into my own hands. David declared his trust in God by not taking a specific opportunity that came before him. If I say no to something or yes to something for no other reason than to say to my own heart, this is my act of trust in God, to not take it into my own hands. That is sometimes the point, and that's good enough. Sometimes you don't need another reason. You see, it's only a slogan until there's something tangible, specific by which I show it. David chose strategically to not kill Saul. It was an action, a clear choice that he made to strategically show that he would not take into his own hands what he thought was in God's hands. Okay, let's move on. Verse 5. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul, and Saul left the cave and went his way. David is convicted in his heart that even though he did the right thing in not killing Saul, what he did do in front of the men he is trying to set an example for was he made Saul look bad. He was not treating Saul with respect. And that's a huge question we need to ponder when we try to go for control, especially when we try to control the narrative about something. Am I treating that person with respect? I know I don't always follow that principle. That's a huge question. David's men can hardly wait to get out of there and tell the story. But David is concerned that the story they will have to tell is not about how David trusted God. The story they will tell is about how David made Saul look stupid. Oh, it's so easy to tell a story, even a story about faith, about trust in a way that makes someone else look bad, doesn't it? To make us look better, it's the humble brag thing we started with. David realizes that in taking a piece of Saul's robe, the message he is sending is not, "I will trust God." The message is he's really sending to Saul and to his men is, "See, Saul, your reign is over. This robe is really mine, and I can take it whenever I want to." David is telling his men, he sharply rebuked is actually a mild way of putting it. It's the literal word there is he tore into them. He ripped into them. Don't you ever do what I just did. I didn't kill him, but actually I did. I did in my heart, and I made him look less in front of his men. You see, you never lift Jesus up by putting others down. Let's see how far David is going to take that. Verse 8. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord, the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? This day you can see with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me to take my life." How can I show I'm trusting God for a better story? Well, several things in here. Number one, trusting God for a better story changes the way I see other people, especially those I feel are controlling me, that are out to get me, or hurting me. How does David see Saul? My Lord, my King, the Lord's anointed, my Father. How does Saul see David? Saul sees and treats David as the enemy. He is on the hunt for David. The reason relationship issues escalate to the point of a battle is because we start seeing the other person as the enemy. But look what he did to me. Look how she's acting. She's against me. She's not helping me. Who am I beginning to see as the enemy? Because the moment I start seeing people as the enemy, especially those over you in any way, those who are in your way at any time, that's the moment I'm in danger of starting to take control in the wrong way, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. Saul was the king. God had put him there. Even though David has been anointed to replace Saul, Saul is the current anointed. Now, just a little aside here. That's how everybody saw it. And it's even indicated in the way these books are ordered. There are 2 books in our Bible called the books of Samuel, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel is all about Saul's reign. We are still in 1 Samuel. Saul dies at the end of 1 Samuel. 2 Samuel is about David's reign. In the perspective of the author, in the perspective of the people of David, we are still in Saul's story. And because David is in that already but not yet period, it is so easy for him to grasp and grab what God has promised him. It's so easy to see the Sauls in our life as the enemy, the ones who are in the way of getting what I need. But we too live in that in-between period right now. We are God's. Nobody can touch us, but we have not yet get everything that He's going to give us. And sometimes we need to just simply back off and say, you know what? I want it, and I know I'll get it, but not yet. Let's go back to how it all started and how it went wrong. Everyone, even your enemy, is created as God's image. To rule under God, not to be God. But do you remember the first casualty of Adam and Eve not accepting that although they were the image of God, they were not God? The first human casualty in that? Their son Cain sees his brother as the enemy and takes his life. So who am I beginning to see as the enemy? Am I being a David or am I being a Saul? Who do you need to go to this week and say, I'm sorry, it's not about whether I'm right or you're right. I realize that I've been seeing you as the enemy, and that's wrong. We'll never become one in the mission of Jesus if we're viewing each other as the enemy, as competition. Paul makes this wonderful statement in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. We love verse 17, which says, anyone who is in Christ is a new creation. But the verse before that says, so, because of what Jesus has done, from now on, we look at nobody from a worldly perspective. He goes on to say how he used to see Jesus that way, and he became an angry and driven man trying to get Jesus. But when he came to see that Jesus was not the enemy, what Jesus had done for him and accepted him, made him into a new creation that changes the way he sees not just Jesus, but everyone. From now on, we regard no one from this worldly perspective. What happens when I trust God for a better story? Well, David does one more thing that is powerful and actually very dangerous. It's risky beyond what we can imagine, but it's powerful. I can't imagine what David's men are thinking when they hear him say what David says next to Saul. In verse 10, he tells him why he did not kill him in the cave. Some of you, or I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. And then, in verse 12, he turns that not just into a description of why he did and didn't do what he did, but then he turns it into a promise, a public commitment to Saul for the future. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. Not today, not ever. Saul, it's not just this time I didn't kill you, but it's Saul, to your face and before your men and before my men, I'm making a commitment. No matter how much you hunt me, I will never kill you, nor will I order you to be killed. Can you imagine how risky, strategically, that promise is for David? He's laid out his cards. Saul knows he doesn't have to look over his back. But for David, it's what he has to do. to win his own control battles, to be accountable before people, that he will never take into his own hands what is really ultimately in God's hands. Isn't that unbelievable? Isn't that the most I will not be shaken trust you can think of? You see, I'll never really make it real, this control battle thing and winning it, until I make it public. You want to deal with your control issues and trust God for a better story? Pick someone to talk to who knows you. Name it before them, with them. By the way, they already know it. They just don't know that you know it. Name it and declare to them that I will never do this again, not because your perspective is wrong, not because you don't have a right to say it or do it, but simply because you want to declare to God in a tangible, concrete, accountable way, I want to deal with my control issues and keep living by trusting God for the better story. Let's just quickly do an overview of how this story rolls out and surface one more question. It's not that David just shuts up and says nothing. That's not what it is. He's pretty direct in pointing out to Saul what Saul is doing, but he does it in a pleading way, an invitational way. Verse 13. As the old saying goes, says David, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hands. And Saul melts. Verse 16. When David finished saying this, Saul asked, is that your voice, David, my son? And he wept aloud. You are more righteous than I, he said. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. And so David gave his oath to Saul. And then Saul returned home. But David and his men went back up to the stronghold. And that means it's all going to be fine, right? No. David is not naive. David has not assumed that because he's turned it over to God, now God will make Saul cooperate and he'll get what he wants. Trusting God does not make David naive and gullible. David does not trust Saul 1 inch. He returned to the stronghold. The story is clear about that. 2 chapters later, chapter 26, we have a story that is totally in structure parallel to this one. It's like the author took the template of this episode and laid it over how he tells that story. It's identical. God does not change Saul, but neither does David change. God gives David another opportunity, an open door to demonstrate that he will live by his commitment. I will never take your life, even though life is still not in David's hands. The reason David does not take things into his own hands when he took the opportunity is not just about how he sees Saul. It's also about how David sees what happens when you see someone as the enemy. Verse 13, what does he say? As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds. So, because of that, my hand will not touch you. Part of the reason David is so convicted about cutting off the corner of Saul's robe is that he realized that in his heart, he was really taking it one step further. He knew he was way too close to killing him. You can't say, well, my heart was good, my heart was right, and then just go and do the wrong thing. Because from evil hearts come evil deeds. And so another control question to ponder is, what is what I'm doing, saying, and thinking really saying about my heart? Have you looked at yourself in the mirror lately and asked that question? Some of us need to look more at what is happening in us than what is happening to us. And to take that a step further, there's something bigger going on here. David realized that violence just begets more violence. I love the way Parks puts it in his book on David. The murder of Saul, he says, would have sent a very specific message to the people of Israel that it was open season to move up the ladder by blood. A takeover would only promote unrest and instability in Israel. It was not good to win people by killing their king. David knows that if he did, he would open himself up to someone else doing the same thing to him, stuck in a kill or be killed cycle for the rest of his life. There was no guarantee Saul would change, and ultimately he didn't. But killing Saul would guarantee a runaway train of death. The moment I say, well, I was just doing to her what she did to me. Well, I was just responding in kind. What I'm really saying is I am not trusting God for the better story. And so a question God is inviting us to ask ourselves is, how is he asking me to stop the cycle of responding in kind? Responding to evil with evil, to violence with violence just does not work. When I trust God for the better story, I will find ways, even just little ways that are in my hands, to stop the cycle of violence, of distrust, of verbal violence like sarcasm and cynicism, of self-promotion, putting myself above others, and start a better story. Even in just my own little world, to start a new chain reaction. Let's zoom this out as we close to the bigger story that David's story points. The story of a greater David, the greater shepherd king, Jesus, who has done what it takes to make us be able and willing to trust him with our story, who has started a new chain reaction. The question is, how is this whole situation inviting me to live in and live out the story of Jesus well? Jesus, who like David heard one of his own men, Peter, say to him, "Die? You don't have to die. Not going to happen to you. Just take control like you can. We're with you." And what does Jesus say? "Get behind me, Satan." Your number one concern is not God's plan. It's what you think your immediate needs are. Jesus, when he had been in the desert without food for a long time, was invited by the evil one to take the shortcut and take control over what was rightfully his, but he said, "No, I will leave it in the hands of my Father." Jesus, the one who came to stop the cycle of evil by taking on himself the full fury of the violence of the author of evil, who in the toughest of times, rather than exercising his rights and flexing his power, said to God, quoting a psalm of David, Psalm 31, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." And in his death, he fulfilled to the greatest degree the promise David believed that God would avenge all wrongs done to me and by me. Jesus, the one who gives us the ultimate reason and the ultimate example of trusting God for a better story, especially when we struggle with things that are out of control, when we feel like we need to grab control. We referred earlier to how Jesus changed Paul's perspective on people, and just listen to how Paul becomes very specific about what that means for when we have it in our hands to control the wrong kind of way. At the end of Romans 12, Paul lays out for us exactly what David lived out for us. Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse 17. "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Got any ways you need to see things differently? To let go of and trust God for his better story? to stop the cycle, first of all, in your mind and then in your action, and try a more Jesus-like approach.